For 3 decades, one man dominated late-night television like no other. His name? Johnny Carson, the king of The Tonight Show. From the 1960s all the way into the 90s, more than 20,000 guests walked across that iconic stage to sit beside him. Movie stars, comedians, politicians, even royalty. Everyone wanted to impress Johnny Carson. But here's the thing, most of them never did. Because behind that charming smile and easy laugh, Carson was known to be famously private, cautious, even a bit cold when the cameras weren't rolling. To his audience, he was America's favorite late-night companion. To his staff, he was a mystery. Few people ever got close enough to see the real Johnny. And yet, every once in a while there were rare guests who cracked through that shell. These weren't just fun interviews. These were moments where Carson actually let his guard down. Sometimes it was with a prank so outrageous that even Johnny himself doubled over in laughter. Other times, it was a heartfelt moment that brought out his humanity, showing that even the king of late night could be vulnerable. And then there were the legends. Guests so iconic that Carson openly admitted he was in the presence of greatness. Today we're diving into those moments. The handful of people who did the impossible. The guests Johnny Carson truly loved. And we begin with one of the wildest and most unpredictable stars of the 1970s, Burt Reynolds. Now here's the thing about Burt Reynolds. When he came onto Johnny's stage, everything changed. Everything. That predictable rhythm, polite laughs, rehearsed anecdotes, and carefully timed punchlines, out the window. Burt didn't treat Carson's stage like a talk show couch. He treated it like a playground. And Carson absolutely loved it. Let's rewind to when Reynolds was at the height of his fame. He wasn't just a movie star back then. He was the movie star. Charismatic, mischievous, and never predictable. While most guests showed up with lines their publicists carefully prepared, Reynolds came armed with something far more dangerous, a sense of humor that had no rules. One night, he pulled a stunt that nobody in late-night television could believe. In the middle of what was supposed to be a serious interview about his film, Burt suddenly grabbed a fistful of shaving cream and smeared it across Johnny Carson's face. Picture that for a moment. Johnny Carson, the most polished man in television, sitting on air with foam dripping down his suit. Most hosts would have been furious. Most guests would have ended their careers in that very moment. But Carson? He erupted. He laughed so hard you could see genuine joy on his face. And if you ask the crew who were there that night, they'll tell you Carson laughed even harder during the commercial break than he did in front of the cameras. That was the magic of Burt Reynolds. He didn't come just to promote a film. He came to play. And Carson recognized it immediately. In fact, he once admitted to a producer, "Burt gets the game. Most guests don't." And that's the key phrase, the game. Because Carson never wanted The Tonight Show to feel like a sales pitch. He wanted it to feel alive, unscripted, maybe even a little dangerous. Burt gave him exactly that. Every time he walked onto that stage, it was like two old friends caught in a prank war. Reynolds would fire off a mischievous line. Carson would volley it back. And together they built this electric back and forth that audiences couldn't get enough of. But here's the hidden part of their chemistry. The thing that made Carson actually respect Reynolds in a way he didn't respect many other guests. Reynolds could take a joke just as easily as he could dish it out. And for Carson, that was everything. See, Johnny had a habit of needling his guests. He'd throw out witty jabs about their careers, their personal lives, or their failures. And a lot of guests hated it. They wanted to control the narrative. Their egos couldn't handle the teasing. But not Burt. If Carson cracked a joke about his box office flops or his very public love life, Burt laughed louder than anybody else in the studio. And that, more than the pranks or the charm, was what mattered most to Johnny. A longtime producer once revealed Carson's secret test for whether or not he liked someone. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about talent. It came down to this: could they take a joke? And Burt Reynolds, he passed that test better than almost anyone who ever sat in that chair. If Burt Reynolds was the king of chaos and mischief when he sat across from Johnny Carson, then Bob Newhart was the complete opposite. And that's exactly why Johnny loved him just as much. Where Burt stormed in energetic and unpredictable, Bob strolled in calm and unshaken. No props, no antics, no outrageous stunts. Just a story, a pause, and that razor-sharp timing that made America laugh without him ever breaking a sweat. Carson once described him as the most effortlessly funny man I know. And coming from Johnny, who built his career alongside the sharpest comics of his generation, that wasn't just praise, that was a crown. Newhart didn't treat The Tonight Show like a stage for rehearsed one-liners or recycled routines. He treated it like a living room. Every appearance felt like a casual conversation, as if he was sitting at home with an old friend. The beauty of it? Carson thrived on that pace. Watching the two of them together was like seeing two jazz musicians trading notes, smooth, improvised, perfectly in sync. Bob would begin a story in his classic deadpan tone. Johnny would interrupt with a sly quip, and without hesitation, Bob would build on it, layering the comedy higher and higher until the audience was roaring. They had a rhythm you simply couldn't fake. Even the crew noticed. One director famously said it was like watching two pros anticipate each other's next move before it even happened. And normally, Johnny was strict about timing. Segments had limits. Commercial breaks had to roll exactly on cue. But when Bob was in the chair, those rules went out the window. If Bob was on a roll, Johnny would lean back, grin, and give the producers the secret hand signal. Hold the break. Let him go. That kind of freedom was nearly unheard of on The Tonight Show. It told everyone watching that Johnny didn't just like Bob as a guest. He trusted him. His comedy wasn't forced. It wasn't desperate. It just flowed. And Johnny respected that more than anything. But there was another reason Bob Newhart stood out: humility. Despite his sitcoms, his sold-out shows, his best-selling comedy albums, he never arrived at Carson's studio with an entourage. He never made demands. He shook hands with the crew, remembered names, and treated every single person from producers to stagehands like equals. Johnny noticed those details. In fact, he despised arrogance. If a celebrity strutted onto the set acting untouchable, Johnny would freeze them out. But Bob was different. He was simple, polite, authentic, and that warmth translated on camera, giving Carson one of the rare comforts he didn't find with most stars: relaxation. That bond grew so deep that Carson even invited Bob Newhart to play golf with him in his personal time. And make no mistake, that meant something. Johnny Carson didn't invite many Hollywood stars into his inner circle. For him, golf wasn't PR. It wasn't networking. It was sacred personal escape. If you got an invite, it meant Johnny truly respected you as a person, not just a performer. That's why Bob Newhart stood in rare company. With Burt Reynolds, Carson got the thrill of chaos. But with Bob Newhart, he found calm confidence, the kind of comedy that didn't need to try so hard, because it simply was. And then came a very different kind of guest. One who didn't make Carson laugh the hardest, but who made him show something far more rare: his emotions. That man was Jimmy Stewart. Now, Johnny Carson was a master of control. Every night he came out polished, sharp, and unshaken. He could guide conversations, deliver monologues, and volley jokes with precision, while never letting the audience see behind his curtain. He was quick, witty, untouchable, always in command. But the night Jimmy Stewart came on The Tonight Show, that all changed. Because to Carson, Stewart wasn't just another Hollywood star from the golden age. He was Hollywood royalty. More importantly, he was the kind of man Carson respected most: humble, grounded, and unspoiled by the slickness of show business. Most old actors leaned on prepared anecdotes or flashy stories to remind the audience of their glory years. Not Stewart. He sat down with a naturalness that immediately stripped away the distance between legend and human being. And then came the moment that stunned the country. Jimmy Stewart quietly pulled out a folded sheet of paper. On it, he had written a poem, a simple piece dedicated to his beloved dog who had recently passed away. He began to read it aloud, his voice fragile yet steady, carried across the studio. Line by line, the audience was silent. And then, something happened that nobody had seen before. Johnny Carson, the unflappable late-night host, began to cry. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't polished. It was raw. His composure broke, and for the first time, millions of viewers watching at home saw Johnny not as a host, not as the king of late night, but as a man who felt lost, a man who loved. That moment is still remembered as one of the most emotional in Tonight Show history. And it happened because Jimmy Stewart, with his simple authenticity, stripped away everything Carson used as armor. No glitz, no jokes, just honesty. From that night forward, Stewart wasn't just a guest in Carson's eyes. He was family, and it proved something profound. Even the king of composure could be humbled, not by fame or flash, but by truth. What made Jimmy Stewart so unique in Johnny Carson's life was not his fame, not his body of work, but his honesty. He would stumble, hesitate, search for words, and in a world built on polish and showmanship, that hesitation felt human, and Carson respected it more than anything. The moment that defined their bond came in 1981. Jimmy walked into the studio, not as the legendary star of It's a Wonderful Life, but as a poet. He had written a piece about Boo, his beloved golden retriever who had passed away. The verses were simple, gentle, painfully sincere. As Stewart's voice trembled, the studio fell silent. The audience stopped clapping. The band grew still. Even the crew held their breath. Then, for the first time in 30 years of television, America saw Johnny Carson lose his composure. His eyes filled, his jaw softened, and a single tear pushed past the wall he had spent a lifetime building. There were no jokes, no clever one-liners, no attempt to break the tension. Johnny just allowed the silence to exist. For that brief moment, the king of late night was not a performer. He was simply a man sharing grief with a friend. A cameraman who was there later said, "I'd been filming Johnny for years, but that night was different. He wasn't hosting a show. He was being human." And for millions of Americans watching at home, the mask finally dropped. They saw Johnny Carson, the man, not the entertainer. From that night forward, Jimmy Stewart's place on The Tonight Show was sacred. Carson's producers noticed the shift immediately. If Stewart was scheduled, Johnny personally asked that his segments be extended. He even told the staff, "Move the commercials if you have to. Give Jimmy more time." And that respect lasted through the end of Carson's career. When Johnny retired in 1992, out of the thousands of guests and performers who had sat in that chair, Stewart was one of the very few he personally called to thank. Think about what that means. After 3 decades in front of 22,000 guests, Carson reached out to Jimmy Stewart because Jimmy represented something Hollywood rarely offered: humility without ego. A star who wasn't selling himself. A man who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. That night in 1981, with just a folded piece of paper and a poem for a dog, Jimmy Stewart cracked open the unshakable Johnny Carson. And that's why to Johnny, Stewart wasn't just a guest, he was unforgettable. But then there was another figure, someone who Johnny didn't cry for, but whom he respected in an entirely different way. A man who represented not vulnerability, but mastery. Not just a performer, but a living legend. And that man was George Burns. By the time George Burns walked onto The Tonight Show set, he was well into his 80s, 90s, even beyond. Most performers his age had faded into quiet retirement. But not Burns. With his ever-present cigar in hand and timing as sharp as ever, he wasn't slowing down. He was thriving. For Johnny Carson, George Burns wasn't simply a funny man. He was living history, a relic of vaudeville. The smoky theaters, the backroad shows, the grind that gave birth to modern comedy. Carson had grown up studying that world, idolizing the timing and rhythm of performers who seemed to turn life into laughter through sheer craft. And Burns was the last of that breed. Crew members remembered something extraordinary. Carson actually got nervous before George Burns appeared. Imagine that. Johnny Carson, who had bantered with presidents, outdueled the sharpest comedians, and held total command of late-night television, getting butterflies at the thought of interviewing a man in his 90s with a cigar. One producer compared it to a pianist being asked to play in front of Mozart. What made Burns remarkable, and what Carson admired so deeply, was that he never coasted. Most comedians peak and then spend the rest of their career recycling stale material. Burns wasn't like that. Even in his later years, he showed up with fresh lines, new riffs, and timing that could bring the house down. Carson once admitted privately, "The rest of us hang on. George just keeps climbing." And that respect showed on air. Normally, Carson was always in control of the rhythm, cutting in with quips, steering the segment, protecting the timing. But with George Burns, he stepped back. He let him roll. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, sometimes longer, Carson would sit back in his chair, grin, and allow Burns to hold the entire stage. For Johnny Carson, silence was the greatest respect he could offer, and Burns earned it. Off camera, their bond ran even deeper. During commercial breaks, Carson was usually all business, checking notes, chatting with producers. But with Burns, he leaned in like a student. He wanted stories about the old vaudeville days, about forgotten names and backroom gigs. In those moments, Carson wasn't the king of late night. He was a kid again, listening to his comedy idol. Burns himself felt that bond too. In his memoir, he once wrote, "If Johnny Carson likes you, you're bulletproof in this business. And Johnny always liked me." The truth was clear. George Burns embodied everything Johnny Carson valued: professionalism, timing, humility, and an endless devotion to the craft. Even into his hundreds, Burns could walk onto that stage, puff his cigar, toss out a line, and reduce an audience to tears of laughter. No gimmicks, no arrogance, just pure disciplined comedy. That's why Johnny Carson treated George Burns with a level of reverence he showed almost no one else. For a host who made his living teasing, joking, and keeping his guests just slightly off balance, Johnny Carson did something extraordinary when George came on. He leaned back, stayed quiet, and gave him the stage. Because in Johnny's eyes, George Burns wasn't just another guest. He wasn't even just a comedian. He was a master of the craft, a reminder of the roots of comedy itself, and that made him unforgettable.